Welcome to the Red Quill Studio. I'm Rachel Barrett, your host, and today's hot topic is fire. We're talking about wildland fire in Montana, our wildland urban interface, and insurance. So today we have our own Montana expert, Audrey Walleser-Martin. Did I get that correct?
You did.
Wonderful. I'm just going to read your bio here and give our listeners a better idea of your immense background. Audrey has over 26 years of experience in emergency response and preparedness. As a responder, she has been deployed on assignments across the United States and 5 countries abroad. She has served as incident commander, operations section chief, liaison, and public affairs and information officer on some of the most prominent incidents in the United States in the past 15 years. In addition, she has spent a significant amount of time lobbying Washington, D.C., and various states for reforms in emergency management, response, and policy, specifically wildland fire. Martin prides herself in her rich Western heritage, mother, wife, agriculturalist, and philanthropist. She brings all of these experiences to her innovative emergency management and response approach. So we have a big situation that we're dealing with. And now I'm hearing that people's rates are continuing to go up for their insurance. And we have all these terms being thrown out, like wildland urban interface. And nobody knows what any of these terms are. So can we just start right there?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is it?
So the urban wildland interface is basically anywhere that the wildland, or the definition of wildland is, meets with public, or meets with public, private property, state property, whatever that looks like. So it's a pretty broad term, but basically it's any place that can be affected by wildland fire, which in Montana, that's everywhere. Like, let's just be realistic. Fire can happen anywhere. So that's a really kind of scary kind of like, oh, do I live in the urban wildland interface? Do I not? And the reality is that Montana overall, pretty much all of Montana is urban wildland interface. So that comes with some interesting challenges. That comes with some opportunities, but lots of challenges.
So we're all affected is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
How do you know if you're delegated into that zone?
Right. So there is a map that was put together by DNRC and other state agencies that talks specifically, and you can kind of zoom in on that map and look and say, hey, this is where my parcel of property is. This is where I live. And what you're going to see on that map is that most of Montana is urban wildland interface, like we talked about, unless you're living in, pretty much downtown, really urban areas in Montana, which Montana urban is kind of a loosely used word compared to some place like Atlanta or New York City or someplace like that. You're going to be in that urban wildland interface.
What does being in the wildland urban interface affect?
So living in the wildland urban interface affects a lot of things. The first thing is, like we talked about with insurance. We talk about not only insurance, but what is that responsibility for you as a property owner living in that interface? We talk about, what does that look like for response? When you pick up the phone and call 911, what does that look like for you? What opportunities are available for you with your property? What can you and can't you do in the urban wildland interface? What does that say? And so there's a lot of things that kind of play into that whole, what does it mean? And basically what it means is we are rugged individualists, and we live in Montana, and we love kind of that last frontier, so to speak, that we do. And people move here because of those opportunities. We love seeing wildlife in our front yard. We love being able to see the mountains and trees and natural habitats. But that also comes with some challenges, especially. So it's a blessing and a curse all in one.
When we have a wildfire, what are the state policies in fire response?
So that is a really interesting question. And a lot of it just depends on where you live. If you live within the confines of a city, if you live within the confines of a county, is your county part of a mutual aid agreement? Is it part of, these kind of county co-op agreements? Like, it's really difficult to really say, hey, I live at XYZ place. That would be specific for that area. So there's a lot of state policies. There's a lot of players involved. So we'll start with the biggest player. The biggest player in the state of Montana is the U.S. Forest Service. Obviously, we have a huge component of federal property in our state. So the U.S. Forest Service is a huge player, especially here in central and western Montana. They have a huge portion of that. Then we go to maybe Bureau of Land Management, which is probably a lot more prominent in places like eastern Montana. Then we go to state. So is it a DNRC, so Department of Natural Resources? Is it state property? Does your property butt up to that? Then we go into county protection. Does DNRC have an arrangement with your county as to whether your property is in state protection? And then we even go even further than that and go, do I have a volunteer fire department or do I have a paid fire department? Do I have access to hydrants? And so it's really complicated. It's this really complicated, multifold system of when we pick up the phone, and now we expect that when we pick up the phone, we're going to get, hey, there's something on fire. We're going to get NYFD. We're going to get these amazing men and women who are going to show up at our house with big red trucks and cool uniforms, and they're just going to put the fire out and it's all going to be okay. Well, in Montana, that's not the case. So if you pick up a phone in about 90% of Montana, you're serviced by a volunteer fire department. So that means you're going to get the football coach, your neighbor's husband, maybe your pastor, and 2 neighbors who are just happen to be home on Saturday afternoon. So that level of training and expertise in those different areas and those different responses play a huge role in what these agencies can do, what their capacity is for response. And so, yeah, it's not just as simple as saying, hey, I'm going to pick up the phone and call 911 and all of a sudden this is all going to be okay. It's really complicated and it's really complex. And for the average homeowner, you just don't know that. You don't know it until you have to pick up the phone and make that call. And then it gets really messy. So
what is the training difference between a volunteer firefighter and a full-time firefighter?
So a full-time firefighter has access to the Montana Training Academy. They go through a rigorous program. Many of them have college degrees in fire and all that. Not saying volunteers don't, but there's a trade program that's put forth for structure firefighters, or what you see, what we call mostly structure firefighters, or a paid department. Volunteer firefighters are guys and women, men and women who just get together and want to support their community. They're going to training a few times a month. There's a certain number of hours they have to meet depending on their department. That training is much different, and a lot of it relies on whether they can get assistance from the state to help bring in specific trainings, or can they get with other departments and bring in these, kind of high dollar trainings. So it's really just individuals who just feel passionate about serving their community and doing the best they can.
And in Montana, we just don't have the funding delegated to having full-time fire departments all over the state. If we're the whole state is a wildland urban interface, we just don't have that kind of coverage here.
Correct. Yeah, we have very few. Over almost 90% of our fire departments are volunteer fire departments. So unless you're living in one of those urban areas in one of the big 7 counties, and there's a few that are the exception, you're kind of basically being serviced by volunteer fire departments and their relationships with state DNRC and their relationships with the Forest Service and all that to really get that fire coverage.
I know last year we had a really big fire over in Horse Gulch, I believe. In that conversation, there's questions about state policy versus federal policy when it comes to that fire going into federal lands. Can you speak a little bit?
Yeah, so Horse Gulch was an interesting conundrum because you kind of had the trifecta, because you have private land, you have state land, you have federal land, and then you have Bureau of Reclamation because it's affecting, obviously, Canyon Ferry. And so you kind of have this whole group of players. And what happens when something like that happens is they come together and they're like, okay, who's really in charge? Like, we have what they call delegations of authority. And it's like, Lewis and Clark County goes to them and says, okay, we're delegating to this incident management team or this group of people. We want you to do these following things. And usually it's life and safety, protect property, make sure the responders are safe. So Lewis and Clark County gives a delegation of authority usually to a state or federal team. Mm-hmm. Horse Gulch was interesting because we had so many moving parts with that. You have state property, you have federal property, you have all that. And so I always tell people, I said, when you look at it and when you're like, well, the fire was burning, we should just go in there and put it out. And I tell people, it would be no different than you or I having a campfire on Friday night. We're roasting weenies with our kids and our neighbor doesn't like, and our neighbor just wants to come over and put it out because it was offending him or he was upset by the smoke or whatever it is. We can't do that. So it gets complicated, though. If just because there's a fire doesn't mean that the state can come in and put out a private fire, the feds can come in and put out a state fire. Like there's a lot of legal levels of legal onion peeling, so to speak, as to who's allowed to do what and how you're allowed to do what. There's what they have called mutual aid agreements, that if the fire gets to a certain percentage or a certain size, and the local fire department says, hey, we need help, there's a call process as to moving that up in size and demand. And so there's a lot of layers to that. And I think many times people go, oh, well, there's smoke on the mountain, so we should just go put that out. It's not quite that simple. It's complicated and it's complex. And so the feds have their own policies, and each forest has their own policies on what that looks like. So, I mean, it's literally like you have to go through this whole process. And I think people get really confused and think it's just this really simple fire, bad, out, it's all good. And we've learned through the years that there used to be what they call the 10 a.m. policy, that every fire had to be out by 10 a.m. And we figured out that that necessarily isn't the best thing for forest health and management. And so we kind of stepped back from that. And then we have all these layers of bureaucracy, and it just gets really complicated. And it's really hard for the average person to understand. And then each of the players within that, it's really difficult for them to be like, oh, yeah, this is who this is. And there's just lots of moving pieces and all that goes on way beyond the fire field, the fire scope. All these things that are going on. So yeah, it's tough.
So for those policies, who's weighing in on the creation of those?
So that's a really great question. A lot of the state policies on the state level are created by our legislature. So that means that all of us as Montana citizens can go up there and say, hey, I had this experience. I would like to see this in our fire policy. Obviously, we have a really deep knowledge base in Montana with Wildland Fire. We have some amazing fire chiefs. We have some amazing resource institutes and all that here in Montana who can speak to that. But literally in Montana, that policy is created by the Montana legislature at the end of the day. I mean, so it's every average day legislator who are creating fire policy, and that may or may not be their forte. So I always tell people, if it's something you're interested in or you have some tidbit, go up there and talk to your legislators, talk to them about what you want to see. Because what we see is when we look at the CWPP, which is a Community Wildfire Protection Plan, is when we look in state law and it says the designation of WUI, or the Urban Wildland Interface, is based on the creation of that CWPP. Those CWPPs are created by the communities in which they started. So I live in Broadwater County. My CWPP was created by people within our own county. So our fire chief, our fire warden, our sheriff, our disaster and emergency services coordinator, our ranches, that kind of our big companies that are within our county. So when we talk about that, those meetings are public, those conversations are had, and we're creating this document that says, hey, this is what our county's fire response is. This is what we delegate to the state. This is what we're delegating to the feds. This is what this looks like. And so that went into state law, and it says, okay, a CWPP dictates what's WUI or what's not. And usually those, who best to solve local issues than the locals themselves. And so it's really important for people to be, we all have things to do, but to be really aware that if this is something you're truly passionate about, making sure you're getting involved at that local level and you're really addressing that stuff, or you're learning it, or you're going and asking those questions, because that can vary from county to county. What your response looks like varies greatly from county to county, just based on resources, based on funding, based on relationships they may or may not have. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies that go into that. So.
Well, I've heard a lot of people asking questions now about this because we have insurance companies who are starting to pull out of states or limit their coverage or rating homeowners and businesses too 2, 3, 4 times what they maybe had previously been paying for that same insurance coverage. So there's a lot of concern there, and that's really a financial stress on top of all the other financial stresses that we have right now. What if I can't get insurance coverage? What if I'm just not insurable anymore? What am I going to do? We've relied on this insurance as something to fall back on. Oh, it's covered, but what if I'm not insurable suddenly? What if we don't have an insurance company that will cover my property? How am I going to take the initiative, protect my home, protect my family? What can I do? So I love that that this sounds like it's very community oriented, that people can get in touch with their local groups here and start weighing in on the fire policies in their areas. And really figure out what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely got input. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's tough. When we get into the insurance side of it, I always tell people, and I've seen this across my career, people always think that they have amazing insurance and it's going to cover everything and it's all going to bring you back to being whole. And that is never the case. I cannot tell you in my 20-some years in fire that I've ever heard somebody say, yeah, just let it burn. It's all great. My insurance company will cover it. That's not the case at all. Especially when they find out that, oh, well, this may not be covered or this may not be covered. And those are just things that, conversations you have with your insurance agent. But we'll go backwards to go forwards. Going back to that, insurance companies are in the business to make money. Mm-hmm. Business is business. We're all in the business to make money. They base their decisions off of losses and risk management that they go through. So if you've been following the news at all, you've seen these huge fires in Hawaii and California. And so there's these huge multi-billion-dollar losses in the fire world. Mm-hmm. And people are like, insurance companies are going, oh my gosh, we're losing billions of dollars. We're just going to cancel policies if there's a chance there's a fire. And I always tell people, I said, that's the knee-jerk reaction. Mm-hmm. Some of them are specific to those specific companies. Some of them are specific to individual issues. Some of them is politics. I always tell people, I said, that one of the hardest things when it comes to insurance companies and fire policy is that many times those insurance companies don't have fire knowledge. They're looking at a spreadsheet. They're saying, okay, in the Wildland fire in Los Angeles, we lost XYZ amount of money in the billions. Okay, we're just not going to insure Wildland fire anymore. And that's not necessarily fair to the customer, because you have customers who are like, I've done all these things, and we'll talk about that in a minute about what they can do to help. So for insurance, it's policy based. I see these numbers and they're really bad. Well, then they have this, they go, well, we're going to say it's based because you're in the WUI and there's this urban wildland interface mapping, and this is what happened in California, and so this is what's going to happen in Montana. And I always tell people there's lots of differences between fire in Montana and fire in California. Lots of differences. There's differences in how we fight fire in Montana and in California. There's differences in the resources available between Montana and California. But when you're an insurance company, you're looking at your bottom line. And that's why they make the choices they do. They utilize and they say, hey, well, it's because of this California fire mapping system, and this is why we're making the decisions we are. And I tell people, you have to empower yourself. At the end of the day, fire or something bad is going to affect all of us. It is a statistical fact, whether it's fire, earthquake, hailstorm, wind, you get in a car wreck, whatever it is, at some point in our lives, we're going to be affected by something. And so what can you do to minimize your damages? Because the reality is, Montana has had fire since the dawn of time. I've heard legislators like, well, if we just do this, then we can fireproof Montana. There is no way to fireproof Montana. And if somebody has that solution out there, by all means, they need to step forward, because none of us that have been doing this for any period of time have figured out how to fireproof Montana. Fire's a thing. But what we can do as homeowners, what we can do as community members, is we can push back on insurance companies who say, well, I'm just not going to insure you. We can talk about that and say, hey, we're going to empower ourselves as consumers. We're going to empower ourselves as citizens. We're going to empower ourselves as communities, neighborhoods, church communities, civic organizations, whatever it is, to really make sure we are in the best position if and when disaster hits us. What does that look like? And so, that's kind of where my passion lies. I love working with people on that kind of stuff. And so we'll talk about that. So what that looks like is that when we look at our property, whether we're in downtown Billings or we're in Ekalaka or we're in Lewistown or we're in Missoula or in Helena, what does our property look like? And what are the hazards that we have? And everybody says, oh my gosh, you have to cut every single tree and it all has to be rock and it won't burn. And I will tell you right now, I have been to places that had all of that stuff around there and their houses still burnt.
Yeah, that's the same thing that I've heard.
Right, yeah.
Nothing can grow 100 feet from your house.
Right.
No plants, no nothing.
Right.
Well, that's not why anyone's in Montana.
Right, exactly. But the reality is that they don't talk about, well, if you have open dryer vents, the embers can get in there, set your curtains on fire, and your house will burn from the inside out, because that happens.
Oh, see, I've never even heard that.
Yeah, so those are all those things, and like, so
there goes dryer vents.
There goes dryer vents. We're just going to have to get rid of those too, and clotheslines and all the things. So we just have to look realistically at our properties and say, okay, what does that look like? I grew up in Northwest Montana, and so I am used to people who want to build very far away from people and want to just be, in these little secluded areas. Trust me, I love that country. It's beautiful. I think that's great. But if we're going to make those life choices, then that life choice comes with other choices we have to make. Do we want a position Do we want our property positioned where if something and when something happens, not if, but when something happens, can I get fire service there? Can I get water to my property? If the power goes out because the fire has burned up, the transformer lines, do I still have a way to pump water out of my cistern or out of my well? Those are all things that people need to be looking at. The most important thing is you have to know what your insurance policy says. What does your policy say about what it will cover, what it won't cover, and what are you doing on your property that may exclude coverage or may exclude a payout? And I've seen this a lot of times in my career where people are like, oh, I had a stack of wood on my porch, therefore my property's not covered. Or I had XYZ. So reading those documents, so when you get them, I think is the first and foremost thing you need to do. The second thing is you have to accept the fact that we are in Montana and we're going to have fire. So what can we do to mitigate our damages and taking ownership of that? And that's tough. I tell people mitigation is a verb. It's not a noun. Mitigation is something that has to consistently happen. And they're like, oh, we did a mitigation project in the South Hills. Yes, you did a mitigation project 1 year in the South Hills. The next year, that grass is going to grow back. There's still going to be pine
Leaves
needles.
are going to fall.
Correct.
And you have to continue.
Right. Mitigation is a verb. Preparedness is a verb. And so I tell people that involves action and that involves staying engaged in that consistent mitigation, that consistent preparedness. And people are like, well, I just don't want to be negative all the time. And we're like, you don't have to be negative all the time, but you have to accept a few things when you move here to Montana. Number one, EMS, medical services are hard to come by. It's going to be an ambulance ride anywhere. And number two, it's going to take a while to get you help, no matter what that looks like. And if there's a fire, you're not the only 911 call. So what can you do to best prepare your property and your home and your area to survive that and to come out a winner in that? And people are like, well, there's no winners in fire. Yeah, fire has a purpose. Fire has some amazing benefits. It's just in the moment we don't see that kind of stuff. So that's tough.
Right. Well, it's important to start with being honest, is these are my choices and this is where I'm at. We can't even plan or learn who we need to talk to about our area and stuff if we're not just honest about where we are, what we're willing to do. So I think
those are all individual choices. That's not something that a state or federal policy can dictate. It's what is your comfort level? And I tell people I've been on fires where I've knocked on doors and said, hey, get out of your house, like evacuate, the fire's coming. And they're like, well, we're going to stay. Okay, let me explain to you what that's going to look like, because it's not what you think it's going to look like.
And that's the nail on the head right there. It's not what you think. Right. How few of us, we just don't know. We don't understand what we're really getting into, or this, like you said, what our insurance policy actually covers. I am one of the few humans that I know who actually reads the fine print. Nobody reads the fine print for anything. We just get used to checking the boxes, time you download something and just sign here, auto sign it. People don't have any idea what they're paying for, what their coverage is. I had a friend who got in a car wreck, and it was just herself, and her policy covered everybody but the driver. What?
Right.
Because she didn't read the policy. What on earth?
Yep.
And, it's hard to think, like, why would you sell me a policy that doesn't cover the driver? The car's not operating. What good is that to me? Well, just because we wouldn't write that policy doesn't mean it isn't written. Right. We have to start being very purposeful and being aware about what are we actually getting ourselves into, because we're responsible for us, right?
Right. At the end of the day. And when we purchase insurance, what is usually the number one thing we talk about? Price. What is that going to cost me? I know I don't, and I don't know any of my friends that go in there and are like, okay, I want to have $25,000 for this and this and this and this and this on my coverage policy. We go in and go, okay, it's me, my family, we have this piece of property, we have this house, here's what it's valued at, here's where I live, what's the best deal you can give me?
It's all numbers.
Right. And so we're just as guilty as the insurance companies are. We're trying to buy a product as cheaply as possible, and we're all guilty of that. I'm just as guilty as the next person of saying, hey, I want something cheap. Cheap isn't always better.
Right.
And cheap isn't always where you need to be. The other thing that people need to consider when they're buying insurance is that before any federal funding, before you're eligible for any federal funding, or before your county's eligible for any federal funding, they take out what insurance companies are supposed to pay out.
Really?
So if your damage to your property, because I like simple numbers, is $100,000, and you're covered for that $100,000, the state looks at your losses as zero for their calculations because you were covered by insurance. Now, take that into consideration when we're looking at places like Hawaii and California. So the state suffered huge losses because it costs money to run those big trucks and have all those amazing young men and women well trained and at the top of it. That all costs money. But what were the actual losses? Insurance companies suffered the largest losses there when it comes to allocating funds. You are not going to get FEMA assistance or whatever new FEMA is going to be, or whatever that new process looks like, because those calculations are taken out of what's not covered by insurance.
Is that, when in the process is that looked at? Is that something that's looked at ahead of time and, for, Lewis and Clark County, this is what we're looking at, this is what's covered? Do they already have those numbers before
No.
FEMA or any other assistance program enters the scene?
No, because we know that when we go out and we're meeting with responders or recovery specialists go out and we meet with you and say, okay, you've lost your house because of a fire or a flood or a landslide or whatever it looks like. And we say, okay, what does your insurance policy look like? And you're like, oh, I'm completely covered. Okay, great. Thanks. Have a great day. Or I have no insurance. And that is becoming more prevalent than I have. The two things, if I've seen anything in my career, it has been not enough insurance or no insurance.
Wow.
A lot of times people will buy property, throw up a house, they take their entire retirement and throw it. We don't want debt. We don't want debt. Well, with that debt comes the requirement for insurance because the bank or the financing company is securing there. So they're saying, hey, you've got to have these minimums. If you put all of your retirement into your dream cabin on Holland Lake and there's a fire and you have no insurance, you're not getting that money back.
Yeah.
You're out it.
And that's really what insurance is about, is catastrophe.
Right.
It's when the unexpected happens, now what?
Correct. And so we have that safety and that security net in insurance. And then we address what you were talking about with businesses and all that, those costs going up. And part of that does go back to personal choices. What have I done on my property to mitigate my own damages or mitigate my own losses? And I think this is where people get really kind of, oh gosh, that takes a lot and that's really scary. But it's having a realistic conversation with yourself, in your business, and in your property, and go, okay, what on my property could I do to mitigate my own losses? And there's literature out there. There's all sorts of stuff that talk about wildland fire and, safety zones and all that kind of stuff. And I tell people, nothing's 100%. I mean, I could tell you stories of driving through fires and like, this house is burnt, this house isn't, and this house isn't. And people are like, well, how come we lost an entire city block and this house stands? There's a lot of factors into that. However, the biggest thing is let's have realistic conversations about our own property and our own comfort level. Do we want a home that may have some things that we not like, or we may have to cut some trees, or we may have to mitigate some things on our own property? Or do we want those things where we want all of our trees growing up all the way around our house, and we want wood stacked on our porch, and we want to be able to have this official rustic thing, and that's fine. Those, again, are personal choices. But like we've taught our kids from the very beginning, choices have consequences. Some are good consequences and some are bad consequences. And I think for a lot of people, they don't understand how impactful those choices are. And as a responder, we make choices based on your choices. And that's where it gets ugly.
A little bit of a burn right there.
It is. It unfortunately is, because if I always tell people, I don't expect to come up to everybody's house and they're all rock and everything. I don't expect that. But if I look at your house and I go, there is vegetation growing up past your windows. You've got needles this deep on your property. I can't get a fire engine in there. There's 55 gallons of oil all over your front driveway. And it's just an absolute mess. I'm going to be like, I can't save that house, but I may go to your neighbor's house who they've got a barbecue, they've got some wood stacked up, and we're like, hey, we can do some mitigation on the fly. And they've mowed their yard and they've raked up their leaves. And it's like, we all know that it's never perfect. But I know when I'm putting my people out there, I'm like, we stand the best chance of saving this property. And those decisions are made. And that's the thing responders don't want to talk about. It's like those choices are made. Like, hate to say it, guys, let's just put it out there. Those choices are made.
We all have dreams about building our own house and we always, envisioning what we want it to look like. I've never heard anybody say, gosh, I wonder what I could do to mitigate my fire risk. Maybe I could build it this way, or is there does the insurance company give you like a dream list? Hey, if you're going to build a house, you might consider doing these things to mitigate your risk, or does anybody have that?
So ironically, yes, it's not the insurance companies usually that do that. There's a lot of information out there about building properties with fire resistant materials. Like I said, there's a lot of information out there about landscaping and safety zones for your house. And there's a lot of historical data that's came out, and we can when we go out, and we'll talk about that a little bit about when we go out and do evaluations on homes, like the information we can give owners. But yeah, you can go and say, hey, I want to build this beautiful dream house and I want it to be brown and I want beautiful fences. And we're like, okay, and there are these materials and there are these plants that are fire resistant. And there's all of those things that we can do to make your dream home as dreamy as you want to and still give yourself that little extra added protection. And so that makes it, as a responder, we can go out and go, oh gosh, they've used fire resistant materials. They've done the right things. It's a beautiful home. We can save it. We can make it as fire resistant as possible. We stand the best chance of developing a fire plan to save that property. So there are lists. There are lists that you can get when you go to a home building store. There are lists you can download and research offline. Montana State University has a lot. The Fire Research Center out of Missoula has a list of that. So those resources are available. Everything from carpeting and drapes to siding. There's some amazing videos on YouTube talking about different siding that's being tested for fire. So those lists exist. That information is out there. So yeah, that's choice number one, is if we want to build our dream home in the beautiful wilds of Montana, what can we do with that? Then we also can go out in the landscaping and say, hey, what are some fire resistant plants? What are some fire resistant materials? So that information is out there. It's just tough sometimes to go dig out, and it's overwhelming. There's just lots and lots and lots of data. So it's many times overwhelming for people to just be like, oh gosh, what am I doing? And does my tree burn? Does my tree not burn? Those kinds of things. So it's just overwhelming.
Well, I think usually we just hear about rocks. It's all rocks.
Right.
Like if I wanted to live in rocks, I wouldn't be living in Montana. Correct. So that's my personal opinion. More trees for me. But I also don't hear about fire resistant plants.
Yeah, that's a thing.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, I mean, everything down to the type of topsoil and the type of landscaping materials that you use to landscape your beds. Like there are fire resistant materials that you can use for that. It's just all that information.
No idea.
It's just all that information that's out there. And so it's tough for people. And I also think it's tough for insurance agents. I think it's tough for people in general. One of the worst things is that policymakers are not talking to insurance companies. And then you have the only connection you have is a lobbyist. And lobbyists are great. They serve their purpose, but they're not necessarily always resident experts or SMEs in that area. So lobbyists are hired to do a job. Insurance companies are looking at the bottom line. The citizens are just like, oh my gosh, the world is literally burning around me and I don't know what to do. Yeah. It's just really overwhelming for everybody. And then there's all this finger pointing, well, I got my policy dropped and my rates went up and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's just incredibly overwhelming. Responders are like, well, how come people don't use resistant materials? And like you just said, I didn't even know that existed. Right. So it's just this big, huge, the village with torches and pitchforks. And we're all really on the same side. We just don't know how to talk to each other. And that's kind of been the element for forever is communication is a beautiful thing.
Across the board.
With everything. So yeah, I mean, that stuff's out there. Fire season, we laugh. It used to be. I mean, I grew up in a fire family. My dad was a fire guy, worked on fire aviation planes for a number of years. So like I've been around fire my entire life. It's just kind of what I know. But it used to be a season. We used to say fire season in Montana began on July 4th. Now there's not a fire season. There's fires year round in Montana. You're like, things can't burn in the snow. I can tell you, honestly, one of the largest fires I've ever been on in Montana was in January.
Oh, no.
And it burnt the top off the top of the snow. And it burnt stuff that wasn't even, it's like tall, dry grass.
It burnt the top of the snow?
That burned off the top of the grass if grass sticks to
it. It's sticking through the grass.
Yeah.
You lost me there for a second.
But yeah, I mean, things burn. Things burn year round. And so, there's not a fire season anymore. It's just like we live with fire. And that's just the way it is. I mean, there's not a whole lot we can do to change that.
So when you, when they come and drop all of that fire retardant, I've heard it actually really makes your plants grow nicely. What is it?
So fire retardant is actually a chemical compound of fertilizer is what it is. And they dye it red so we can see where we drop it out of these large airplanes. It does. It's kind of an amazing little plant growth after the fire. It's one of those benefits of fire that, little fire, burn off all the icky stuff, put some fertilizer on it, you got amazing fields. Don't recommend it, but it is one of the benefits of fire.
Isn't it sticky?
It is very sticky. Yeah, it's very sticky. Yep. Yeah, I don't recommend getting in it.
So if, let's say, there's a fire that's sort of near my house and they're starting to dump fire retardant.
Right.
That's not something they ask you to do, right? They just start dumping stuff?
That's correct.
Like, there isn't like, look out below.
No, there's not a look out below.
Take your horses in quick or they're all going to be pink.
No. Usually, though, in a perfect world, you're going to be seeing the sheriff's deputy saying, okay, you need to evacuate. There's an active fire scene, wherever that sheriff has kind of got what we call a trigger point saying, okay, we're going to issue evacuations in this area. Take your horses and you got to go because you're going to come home to it may be all pink. There's that process in there. But sometimes you don't get that. And sometimes fire's on you before you really have the ability to go, oh my gosh, I have time to get out. So, there's all of that kind of stuff. I've had fire on my own property. I've had fire around my own animals. And literally it was a decision of, what do we do with them? I locked mine in the barn and, put stuff all the way around my barn. And so I have pictures of where the fire burned completely around my barn because I put my, teenage kid out there. I'm like, just keep it wet, stay in the rocks, let it, and it was just a grass fire, but it was still that thing of, what do you do with animals? And I don't have time to evacuate. I don't have time to go get the truck and load up all the stuff. And so all of those kind of things. And so that kind of segues into what we were talking about with being prepared. Everyone needs a preparedness plan. Remember in the 80s when we were kids growing up and stop, drop, and roll was the thing, like we taught everybody, stop, drop, and roll. And you had this special meeting spot when your house caught on fire and you all climbed out the windows and you went to the special meeting spot. Somewhere along the line, we as adults just stopped doing that. And and we stopped making plans. That was like the elementary, most rudimentary thing to do. We stopped making those plans. Probably
when they said you need to buy a special ladder. You can't just jump out of your first story window anymore.
Broken legs are bad. They're frowned upon. But we don't make plans anymore. And that's something that every family needs, especially living in the wooey of what does that look like if a fire breaks out across the street? Or what does that look like if a fire comes down the hill behind our house? What are we going to do? And there's that information out there. There's, the preparedness basics of papers and pets and prescriptions and this whole little preparedness thing there. And then we look at, okay, most of us in Montana have dogs, horses, some sort of livestock or some sort of animal. What are we going to do with them? Because those are really hard to kind of figure out. And so again, being engaged in your community, being engaged in those conversations at a county level, what that plan looks like on a county level. I see a lot of little horse, ranchettes. They don't have trailers. How are they going to get those horses out of there if there's a fire? That's a huge thing that we see as responders all the time. I have fed a lot of chickens in my career because people had to leave them. I mean, they just didn't have a choice. And we, as responders, try to do the best we can. But our job at the end of the day is to protect life and safety. And so that's your home.
Yeah. Not to feed your chickens.
Not to feed your chickens. I've cut a lot of fences in my lifetime, just letting horses and cattle go just so they have a chance to survive. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, the whole 10 yards. That because people didn't have a plan before, they had no way to get their animals out, and we're just cutting fences to hope for the best that those animals can make it to safety. Unfortunately, it's not something I have the time to do. I don't have time to save your house, feed your chickens, take care of Fluffy the cat, and do all that kind of things and save your neighborhood. My job is to try to save as much of your neighborhood as possible. So we really rely on people to have those plans for their own safety and their own welfare, and coming together as a community, as a neighborhood, as a church group, and just really working on having those plans so we can do the best for you. The secondary side of that is that if your insurance does get canceled, or they're like, oh, well, we're going to jack up your rates, you can lobby and advocate for yourself and go, no, here's pictures of my house. Here's my preparedness plan. Here's what I have at my house. Here's what I've done to my property. And I think you're wrong. And here's why. And go.
I didn't know that was an option.
Yeah. So it's no different than when you go buy a car, right? You go buy a car from Chevy or Ford or wherever, and you go, no, I'm not paying for that because it doesn't have this cool feature or that cool feature or that cool feature. Same way we negotiate that all the time. Is you're the consumer, and you can be like, no, I'm going to pay. This is what I've done. Yes, they can tell you we're not going to listen to you, but it empowers you to be like. Most insurance agents are like, what do you have? Like, oh, I have a complete home inspection that I've went through with a professional, and we've addressed the dryer vents, or we've addressed all of these other things. Hey, I resided my house last year and I used flame resistant materials for that. Here's the ratings, here's the information, here's the study on that. And it really gives people the ability to put them again back in the driver's seat to negotiate those rates with your insurance company, or to go to your insurance company and say, my policy got canceled because you say I'm at high fire risk, but here's the information specifically about my property.
So what information are they using to determine what your fire risk is? Do they have an agent that comes out and goes over your property and says, super high fire risk, rate them up, or this looks pretty good?
Right. So a lot of that it's very company specific. Some companies, and so again, it goes back to how much is your property insured for? What are you insuring for? And some insurance companies do send out someone to look at your property and say, okay, this is actually what it is. But in Montana, that rarely happens unless it's a really super high dollar property. So a lot of times they just say, oh, well, you're in the WUI and it's this kind of median house, and they just assume that it has this material, it has this, and it does all these things. There's ISO ratings, which are the insurance ratings, which says, okay, in your area, your fire department is volunteer. They have this many people in your fire department. You don't have a huge water source. You don't have city water. You don't have fire hydrants. You don't have cisterns, or you don't have what other, and there's all these little checks, and it goes into this magical algorithm, and they like, yes, no, maybe, higher rates, lower rates. And so there's all those things that when you're looking at building a house, or you're looking at purchasing a house, or you're looking at any of those kinds of things, you need to be looking at that kind of stuff as well. I know when I purchased my house, I was like, what is our ISO rating? And the lady goes, ISO rating. I'm like, yes, the insurance rating for fire. And she's like, well, the fire station's like down the road. And so the poor realtor just didn't know what I was talking about. But those are all things as consumers, again, we get to make those choices. We get to ask those questions. And I mean, I've met some realtors who were amazing. Like, this is what the ISO rating is. Obviously, you're going to be better rated if you're in an urban area, because you have access to pick up the phone, call 911, guys with big red trucks come, you're covered. Where those of us in the rural areas, like, what is the response time? What does that look like? And so those are all things, again, choices you get to make. Now, again, we can mitigate some of those damages. We can mitigate some of those risks, but you have to take the ownership for that.
And that's really where it starts. So the insurance companies, when they are doing that rating process, and obviously there's maps that they use to do that, are those specific maps to each area, to each state, or what is that rating off of?
Yep. So again, when we look at what classifies the WUI, that in-state code comes off of the CWPP. So that map that you can go online and pull down talks specifically about. So all of this blue is all WUI. And so as we can see, that's pretty much most of Helena and most of the county.
So you have all this, this is all top of the mountain trees up here though, right?
Yep.
And that's not WUI?
Well, and more, no, because there's not development up there. And more than likely that's probably Forest Service property would be my guess, just based off of what that looks like. So you're not seeing development. So when we think WUI, we think development meets wildland. So that's kind of what it is. There are a few of these pockets you see in here. There's these little tiny islands, probably more than likely parks, things like that. But for the most area, we see the same thing even in Billings with Yellowstone County, but Lewis and Clark County, your CWPP or your Community Wildfire Protection Program says that all of this area is all WUI. And it has the ability to be affected or impacted by wildland fire. So that's a huge section of the county. And so when insurance companies look at that, they're like, oh my heavens, this is all WUI. And again, it goes back to educating even your insurance company, saying, okay, what this looks like for LA is not what it looks like for Helena. What it looks like, and that's huge because sometimes even your agent's just like, I don't know how to do that. And so that's why we really encourage homeowners, again, make those choices, come up with that plan, have some experts come out, look at your property and say, okay, what can I do to mitigate my losses, or what can I do to minimize my impacts if a fire hits me? And that's true with anything. We think about, we talk about putting smoke detectors in our house. Again, a mitigation tool. Carbon monoxide detectors, again, a mitigation tool. All of those things. Don't have big mean dogs at your property because that's a mitigation tool to lower your insurance rates or to make you insurable. So a lot of that, again, there's this kind of conundrum between insurance companies making the decisions they do because they're looking at their bottom line, and empowering yourself as a consumer to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I know people who have taken evaluations of their homes and they went to their insurance companies and their insurance company says no. And they were able to utilize resources like the auditor's office or other things to really reach out to the insurance companies and go, no, this is legitimately the way it is. And so without people making, again, all goes back to choices. What do you want to do? Because panicking is the worst thing you can do. The conversation needs to move from insurance companies not insuring me and fire itself to what can I do to solve that problem in the middle. We're not going to change insurance companies from not wanting to lose money, and we're not going to stop fire in Montana. So what can we do in the middle as consumers? What can we do as Montanans to mitigate our losses and our damages?
Well, you just mentioned the auditor's office. What is the purpose in reaching out to your auditor's office? What can they do?
So the auditor's office is kind of the centralized location for all questions insurance-wise. So they kind of mesh that together. They kind of mesh that, here's our state laws, here's our state policies, and they are who kind of approves or disapproves of rate increases, the insurance companies that are in Montana. And if you have a question, concern, or you have an issue that you haven't been able to solve with your insurance, you can work through them. They have some consumer advocates who can really kind of help you work through that. Or if you're affected by fire and your insurance policy isn't doing what it says it's supposed to, they can kind of serve as that intermediary to kind of help you resolve those issues.
It sounds like the whole process in Montana is very complex and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. What are we doing well on as a state, and what do we still need to have some work?
What do we do well? We have some amazingly well-trained and educated firefighters. Like the first responders that we have in Montana are doing the best that they can. We have some amazing resources. I mean, we're pretty lucky in Montana. We've got the Aerial Fire Depot. We've got the Research Center. We've got some pretty amazing fire resources here. And we keep bringing more in every year. So we have some resources, which is great. What are we doing not so well? I think the first thing is that it used to be, back in the olden days, we used to talk about fire prevention more. And yes, we still have fire prevention services. Don't get me wrong. But we just started having those conversations with people coming out and saying, hey, here's your house. This is what we're doing. And we kind of stepped back from preparedness, and we kind of, one of the biggest problems we have in Montana is we point fingers and we go, oh, that's this person's job to do it, or it's this person's job to do it, or it's this person's job to do it. And we get into state agency bickering of, I don't have jurisdiction, or I don't have jurisdiction, and let's put it on the county sheriff, or let's put it on the county, coordinator of whatever. Those guys don't have the time either, or they don't have the money. And then we just kind of circularly have these arguments consistently. And we've been having these arguments for a long time. We are not educating the public like we need to on fire. Bottom line, end of discussion. We had reached a point probably in the late 90s where people understood it. Montana does not look like it did in 1995, 1996, even how it looked in 2010. Montana's dynamics have changed. Montana's people have changed. People have moved in. Institutional knowledge has left. And all of those things. We need to get back to the basics of educating people about fire. We hear all the time, there's smoke in the air, and we don't ever want to have those conversations until there's smoke in the air.
Right.
We need to be having those conversations today. We need to be having those conversations now, rather than waiting to June or July and going, oh my gosh, can I get somebody to come out and do a fire evaluation on my house? When nobody's available because we're all out fighting fire. That is probably the worst thing we do, is that we have really taken a step back from doing that basic fire education, that basic knowledgeable preparedness portion. Some people say, oh, well, people should just know it. And some people say, well, we don't have the money. And it doesn't cost a lot of money to get your friends together or your church community together and say, okay, how do we fix this? Yeah, you can call and write into your local fire department and see if they can get somebody to come out, or, there's a lot of ways you can do it. But the problem is Montanans don't do it, or they don't know it exists.
Right.
And so that is probably the thing we do the worst, is that we try to have these conversations in June, July, and August when there's smoke in the air. And then when we need to be having these conversations, we've already forgotten.
Right. No preparedness there.
No, we're just kind of like, oh my gosh, stop, have everybody panic. And that's the worst thing we can do. So we need to get back to fire education.
Are there organizations that just go around the state doing educational?
There's a lot of resources available. Fire Safe Montana does a fantastic job. There's a lot of great resources that they've collaborated with over the years, and pamphlets and handouts they have. U.S. Forest Service has some, the DNRC does. There's a lot of resources available. Again, you just have to know where to go. You have to know who to ask. You have to know where to get that information. And I think as the public, I think one of the other things that's really overwhelming is a lot of times you get this pamphlet and it's 5 pages and the print is 8 font, and there's these diagrams and this engineering, and you're like, holy Hannah.
What is this?
Yeah, and we read it and we take it home and our spouse is like, I don't even understand that. And we need to get back to those basic conversations of we can approach the 5-page pamphlet, and that's very important. But let's get back to basic understanding of fire in your community, fire in Montana in general, and just kind of build off of that. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon, and we just have to keep it that way. So, I mean, there's lots of information out there. You just have to go look for it. Some of the information is convoluted. Some of it's contradictory. There's just a lot out there. So
you have your own business.
I do.
Agate Consulting, and you're here close to Helena.
I am.
Tell me about the services you provide.
So the services we provide is we work with private people, everything down to homeowners, all the way up to large scale businesses and developers on developing emergency preparedness plans. So not just fire, we do wind, we do flooding, we do all of that kind of stuff, and really look at a total overall emergency preparedness plan, because fire is only one of the guarantees we have in Montana for disasters. We either have too much water or not enough, as the old adage goes. We've got some pretty interesting things. We've seen some crazy weather events even in the Helena Valley recently. So we look at doing, I like to tell people we do total risk management, everything. And the other things to think about now is that we have public, man-made disasters, whether that be traffic or, all of these other kind of really horrific things we've seen, even in our own communities recently. So having those conversations, we work with private agencies, church groups, organizations, and all that, really just to kind of get people thinking about it and talking about preparedness across the board. Fire is always my favorite thing, of course, because it's my jam. But overall emergency preparedness is really important for everyone. So having those plans is important.
Awesome. So when you come out and help develop a plan, you said you do a little bit of residential. What does that look like for a homeowner? So
what that looks like for a homeowner is a homeowner chooses to use our services. We come out and I'll sit down with the homeowner and I'm like, okay, so tell me about your property. This is where we find out that the big tree in the front yard was planted by great-great-grandma, and it's been there for 5 generations. And so we're probably not going to talk to the homeowner about whacking that down, because that's part of who they are. That's part of the thing that makes their property important.
But that could be an option to not cut it down?
That could be an option to not cut it down. But we can talk about limbing it up. We can talk about cleaning up the area underneath it, and how close is it to your house, and what can we put on your house? Can we maybe look at changing your roofing, or what does that look like? Or hey, I see you're doing some reconstruction on your exterior. Let's talk about fire resistant siding. Let's talk about, you love to garden. Let's talk about fire resistant plants close to your house. So we can have those conversations. And I really like to kind of develop that rapport going, you tell me about you and tell me about why this is important. And then we can kind of go down the road of what in your home is a non-negotiable. Like, we all have those one things, like we're not going to knock down the tree that great grandma planted in 1852. That's fine. But let's talk about how we can limb that tree up. Let's talk about how we can rake up those needles. Let's talk about the fact if you need to replace your roof. Have you thought about a fire resistant roofing materials? Let's talk about what kind of water source do you have? Do you have a generator? Do you have out in your shop? Do you have jet fuel stored? I know we joke about those things, but we are in Montana, and people have chemicals and all of these kinds of things. Tell me about the rest of your property. Is it, how far out do you mow? Tell me about your community. I mean, are people shooting off bottle rockets in your field next door? These are all conversations to have with the homeowner. It's really simple to come out and do a drive-by and say, well, yeah, cut down the tree, get rid of the plants, and put rocks in, and it's all going to be better. But that's not how it's done. That's not practical. Because I'll guarantee you, if I go to a homeowner that has a 5th generation tree out there and their spouse loves to garden, and we're like, just get rid of those things, I've already lost you. So let's talk to you about what's important to you. Hey, you have this beautiful wood swing on your porch. That's fantastic. Probably don't need nylon cushions on that beautiful wood swing because those are not fire resistant, so like having those conversations of what can we do to keep your Montana dream alive, but still yet prepare you for all the bad things that can and will happen in Montana. And that's just a given.
Well, and it doesn't sound like they all have to be a large expense either.
No. Changing
the cushions, I mean, you could recover those with just another fabric. You don't necessarily have to buy a whole new swing. You can, if you're planting plants anyway. So why don't you pick out of these 6? Something that you like, it sounds like it doesn't have to cost a fortune.
No.
But that you really are brainstorming to find solutions so that we as homeowners can make better choices and protect our property.
Correct. Yeah, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. There are things you could probably do to your home that will cost significant amounts of money that would improve your fire safety or your disaster rating. And those are conversations you can have with not only your homeowner, with your insurance, but you can also be having that with your homeowners association, your builder, if you're in the process of building or remodeling. And even look for tax credits. Some of that stuff is covered under tax credits.
Who would know about tax credits?
Yeah. Tax credits are, like talking to your accountant or learning all those kinds of things. Those are all really important things when you look at, kind of improving your property and preparing for those disasters and preparing for those things. You can ask your insurance agent, say, hey, what are my largest, disasters, or what are the largest things that affect our property? And sometimes the agents know and sometimes they don't. They're like, well, we have to go find out. And being able to mitigate for those things that are most likely to happen in your area.
What a great conversation to have, though, because if your agent doesn't know, the learning opportunity for them as well. And the more you know, that will transfer to others in your community as well. And hopefully, if we all can do our part here and really be proactive and being responsible for what we love in our own space, then that will also help mitigate those around us as well.
Absolutely. And when we look at, community development plans or, zoning plans or building plans or kind of the long-term look at our communities, whether it be, the long-term public building or communities, making your communities more fire or emergency resistant and all that. And that's why, I've worked with a lot of developers who are like, how do we do this? And I'm like, one way in, one way out is not an emergency plan. Like, that's just not feasible. And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, you got to have another exit, hon. But those are all conversations, when you look at those long-term, county plans, city plans, even if you're in a homeowners association. What can you do within your own homeowners association? Even if you're in downtown Billings, Missoula, Helena, whatever, what can you do within your own homeowners association to prepare your community for whatever? Because I like to tell people all the time, as I said, yeah, that fire can be up on the mountain, but that ash and those embers come to the town. So what does that look like for you? So, yeah, I mean, nobody's
think about that.
No, you don't. That's what I get to do. I get to think about all the horrible things that happen. I'm really not fun to have at parties.
Well, this conversation's been fun.
Yeah.
Very informational, and you will be doing a class here for us.
Yeah.
In the very near future as well, and we'll make sure to put those details on our website as well, so you can be looking for that on redquillstudio.com. And I'll make sure to put Audrey's website for Agate Consulting
Absolutely.
in the link as well, so you can find her easily, and we can all do a little bit better at being prepared for this fire season, which is fast approaching.
It is.
So thanks so much, Audrey, for coming and teaching us and being part of the solution.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.